Please set in a
recording in progress.
Meditation posture and close the eyes. Put our attention on the silence that is always there deep in the mind. Connect with that silence. Become the silence. You are the silent witness. Now let's listen to the Yoga Vashishta. Book 4, Chapter 34, continuing with verse 34. The demons, Dhamma, Vyala, and Kata, were destroyed because they relied on their minds. But Bhima, Vasa, and Dhrita were saved by their belief in the Supreme Soul as pervading all things. Therefore, reject the examples of the former and imitate those of the latter. Be not guided by the example of Dhamma, Vyala, and Kata in the lesson that was first delivered to me by Brahma, the lotus-born, and my progenitor himself. This lesson I repeat to you, O Rama, as my intelligent pupil, that you may never follow the example of the wicked demons, Dhamma, and others, but imitate the conduct of the good spirits, Bhima, and others in your conduct. It is constant pain and pleasure that forms the fearful feature of this world. There is no other way of evading all its pangs and pains except by your apathetic behavior, which must be your crowning glory in this life. That's important to point out, that Vashishta is recommending that we not rely on our mind, but we rely on the silent witness as our identity. When we adopt this reliance on the silent witness as our identity, we identify with the silent witness, not the mind. Then we have reached another milestone in the levels of consciousness. Those who rely on their body as who they are at level of consciousness below 200. Those who rely on the mind as who they are at level of consciousness 200 to just below 600. and those who rely on the silent witness as who they are at level of consciousness 600 and above. The apathy that is listed as one of the characteristics at the lower levels of consciousness below 200 is not the apathy that is being recommended here by Vasishtha. It is the apathy of enlightenment, of level of consciousness 600. It is a different form of apathy. Apathetic behavior means you're not attached to or caring what is going on in the world around you. When you are established in the body as who you are, or established in the mind as who you are, this form of apathetic behavior is completely defeating. It ruins the opportunity of the life as a human being. When you are at level of consciousness 600 and above, totally identified with the silent witness, this apathy is real in the sense that you no longer are concerned about or connected with the mind and the physical body as who you are. That's not to say that those at level of consciousness 600 and higher are not caring or feeling compassion for the others in the world. It's just that they realize this is all an illusion. Chapter 35. Detachment, description of detachment and bliss. Vasishtha continued. Blessed are the virtuous who have cleansed their hearts from the dirt of ignorance. Victorious are those heroes who have conquered their insatiable and uncontrollable minds. It is self-control, the management of one's own mind, that is the only means of wading through all troubles and distress, amid all the dangers and difficulties of this world. Hear the summary of all knowledge and retain and cultivate it constantly in your mind. The desire of enjoyment is our bondage in the world, and its abandonment is our release from it. What need is there of many teachings? Learn this one truth as the sum and substance of all. All pleasures are poisonous and destructive. You must fly from them as from venomous snakes in a raging fire. Of course, it is important for us to realize we cannot make a mood of flying from the venomous snakes and raging fires of life. To do so is another form of destructive apathy. What Vashishta is saying here is to startle the ego and hopefully awaken the ego to its illusory nature. The ego is our friend in charge of our life as long as we have karmic traces. When karmic traces are all balanced, we have no ego. So until we have all of our karmic traces balanced, we need the ego. Because it is the ego that will direct the mind by thinking the thought that will balance the current karmic trace. Because that is the only way we're going to balance the karmic traces. They must be balanced by introducing the opposite. Consider well and repeatedly that all that can be perceived by the senses are like hydras and dragons, and their enjoyment is gall and poison. Keep them at a distance and pursue your lasting good. The mind of desires produces destructive evils, like sterile ground is feral only for thorns and brambles. The mind, devoid of desire, lacks its expansion, as the heart, lacking its passions and affections, is curbed and contracted in itself. The well-disposed mind always teems with virtues that are opposed to wrong acts and vice. Just like fertile ground grows good and useful trees in spite of weeds and bushes. When the mind gains its serenity by culture of good qualities, the mist of its errors and ignorance gradually fade away like clouds before the rising sun. Good qualities shining in the mind like stars in the moonlight sky give rise to the light of reason, like the bright sun of the day. As the practice of patience grows familiar in the mind, like medicinal Vamsalochana within bamboo, it gives rise to the qualities of firmness in a man, like the moon brightens the spring sky. Company of good men is a tree that gives its cooling shade of peace and yields the fruit of salvation. Its effect on righteous men is like that of the stately Sarala tree, distilling the juice of spiritual joy from the fruit of samadhi. Thus prepared, the mind becomes devoid of its desires and enmity, and is free from all troubles and anxieties. It becomes dull to the feelings of grief and joy, and also of pain and pleasure, and all its restlessness dies in itself. Its doubts about the truth of scriptures die away, just as the table of values and all its curiosities for novelties are put to a stop. Its veil of myths and fictions is unveiled, and its ointment of error is rubbed out of it. The mind's attempts, efforts, malice, disdain, distress, and disease are all removed. The mist of its grief and sorrow and the chain of its affections are all blown and torn away. It discards the children of its doubts, repudiates the consort of its greed, and breaks loose from the poison house of its body. It then seeks the welfare of the soul and attains its godly state of holiness. It abandons the causes of its stoutness and relinquishes its choice of this thing and that. It remembers the dignity of the soul. It casts off the covering of its body like a straw. The elevation of the mind in worldly affairs tends to its destruction, and its depression in these leads to its spiritual elevation. The wise always lower their minds' pride, but fools are for elevating them. The mind takes the world its own and ranges all about it. The mind raises mountains and climbs over them. The mind is like an infinite vacuum. It comprehends all emptiness in itself, and it makes gods of friends and foes of others. When understanding is soiled by doubts and forgets the true nature of consciousness, and when it is full of all its worldly desires, then it takes upon the name mind. Consciousness, pervaded by its various desires, is called the living soul, or the animal soul, which is distinct from the rational soul. Understanding, which forgets its intellect and falls into the air of its own personality, in what we call the internal principle of the mind, which is all hollow within. The soul is not the man, nor is the body, nor its blood. All material bodies are only gross and dull matter, but the soul in the body is empty air and intangible. The body being dissected into atoms and analyzed in all its particles contains nothing but blood and entrails, just like the plantain tree when cut into pieces, presents nothing but its folded rinds. Know that the mind and living soul make a man assume his mortal form. The mind takes its form by itself, according to its own choice. Man stretches his own sphere of action by his own choice, only to entrap himself in it, just as the silkworm weaves its cocoons for its own imprisonment. The soul lays down its error of being the body when it has to leave the body at some time or other. Then the soul assumes another form as the germ sprouts forth into leaves. As the desire or thought is in the mind, so it is born in its next state of transmigration. Hence, the newborn babe is given to sleeping because it thinks itself to be still dead, lying in the nighttime of his death. It is also given to the dreaming of those things which had been the objects of its desire or thought in its previous state of birth. So sour becomes sweet by mixture with sugar, and bitter seed produces sweet fruit by being sown with honey. So on the contrary, sweet becomes bitter by mixing in gall and wormwood. Aiming after goodness and greatness makes a man good and great. One wishing to be an Indra, a lord of gods, dreams of his lordliness in his sleep. An inclination to meanness demeans a man, and a tendency to vileness maligns his conduct in life. Just like one deluded by his imagination of devils comes to see their apparitions in his nightly visions. But what is naturally foul or fair can hardly turn otherwise at any time. As a still lake never becomes muddy and a dirty pool never becomes glassy, the perverted mind produces the fruits of its perversion in all its actions, while pure-mindedness is filled with the effects of its purity everywhere. Good and great men never forsake their goodness and greatness, even in their fall and decline. So the glorious sun fills the vault of heaven with its glory, even when he is sinking below the horizon. Now let us close our eyes, continuing established as the silent witness. and perform Trimana Sanyama on the esoteric Mahamantra to balance all the karmic traces that have been touched upon and enlivened by this reading of the Yoga Vasishtha. Take her death.